I'm Rose Loveall. I own Morningsun Herb Farm, a small specialty nursery located in the hillsides of Northern California. I love growing herbs. Obviously, this is what I do for a living. I want you to love growing herbs too. So for the next 8 weeks, I'm going to take you on a journey of how to grow herbs in your garden. We may be focusing on just one herb like basil. We may be focusing on your spring garden or how to plant in a raised bed. But every week, you'll learn a little something new for your garden. Sit, 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 sit. Good boy.
Aw, very good. The little tail is wagging.
I look forward to you joining me on this weekly video series. This is April, and there's only one word that we think of in the herb business in April: basil. This is our favorite herb. We grow it all the time. The botanical name, Ocimum basilicum. Everyone knows the common basils, but what I'm hoping to do today is to talk to you about some of the other basils that you really need to grow in your garden. During my college days, a friend of mine cooked a meal for me and he said, "I'm making you pesto. It's the best thing you'll ever have." Well, I've never eaten basil and I'd never eaten pesto before, but one time and I was hooked using this beautiful little Genovese basil. I took it back to my parents, and my father, who was very dramatic, said, if I had $1 million, I'd spend it all on basil. Well, over the next 25 years, he and my mom ate pesto every week. And in the wintertime, she had to freeze enough for him and take it on vacation, take it camping, everywhere. So it's been a favorite of mine for about 25 years, and now no garden in America is complete without a basil plant. Our most common basil, our Genovese basil, is grown for our pesto making and for fresh use. There's lots of other kinds of basils though, so I want to talk about those today. First, I want to start though with a little history of basil, because there's always some funny stories in the herb world. Back in the 17th century, it was believed that basil would actually make you go crazy. So people didn't want to eat basil because they thought it would make them die and go crazy. So basil leaves were not used until really the 20th century, except by the Italians and Greeks. Now, of course, it's used in cuisines all over the world. It's native to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, and all over Asia, both temperate and tropical climates. Here in California, it's grown mostly as an annual plant. It really likes warm temperatures, and it does not like cold nighttime temperatures at all. There's a lot of really fun stories about basil. Basil is considered now the herb of love. So if you have a little pot of basil sitting on your windowsill, that means, in Italy at least, that you're ready for a suitor. So keep that in mind if you're going to be putting your basil out on a windowsill this spring. It may be calling a new love into your life. So what are all the different kinds of basils? Why do we want to grow all these wonderful basils? Besides our beautiful Genovese basil and our Italian large-leaf basil, right now in these little pots they look very similar, but they have a little bit different flavor. One of them, the Genovese, is a little stronger, and the Italian large-leaf is a little bit milder. These are both going to get about 2 feet tall, and they're going to be green plants with white flowers. Genovese basil and Italian large-leaf basils are our common standard basils that we grow in our garden. There's a lot of other basils to grow. We're going to talk about each of those and what their uses would be. So let's talk about some of the other basils that you will want to grow in your garden. One of my favorites is called Basil Napolitano. It's got a huge leaf. Even in a little 3-inch pot, the leaves are giant, and in the ground, the leaves are going to get up to 4 to 5 inches wide and long. This basil is also used a lot for pesto making. It's a little bit milder, so if you don't like the flavor of lots of licorice in your basil, this is a much better basil to use. It's a little more gentle as far as its sun needs, so sometimes we plant this in a little bit of shade. It's wonderful to use fresh. So if you're making a hamburger and you, instead of putting lettuce, want to put something more interesting, a couple of leaves of this beautiful basil are really an incredible little addition. Also, if you're making a grilled cheese sandwich, a little bit of basil on that grilled cheese is wonderful. It's a lovely plant to grow in the garden too. My favorite basil is lemon. And lemon basil is actually a different species. There are 62 different species of basil in the world. We really only grow 2 or 3 different species. This is Ocinum citriadorum. So this is lemon basil, and I wish you could smell this. It's a bright lemony scent. It's just wonderful. Oh. Now this is a great summertime herb, in particular because I can think of countless different things to do with this plant. So besides making a pesto, which would be great with fresh fish or chicken, or with some sort of a pasta, or maybe even vegetables like zucchini, it makes a great bar drink addition. If you're making a little gin and tonic, or if you're muddling up a little something extra for a martini, lemon basil is the thing to use. If you're a teetotaler, it's an amazing tea plant. Basil is a member of the mint family, and so like many of the other mints, it has the qualities of being a good digestive. So an after dinner tea of a little bit of lemon basil would make a wonderful addition after a heavy meal, barbecue, where you're trying to settle your stomach. It's just terrific. Lemon basil sorbet, lemon basil stuffed into chicken, lemon basil ice cream, lemon basil lemonade. It's just endless possibilities with lemon basil. It's really an amazing plant. We don't have to just have green basils though. We can have basils that have amazing colors. 2 of my favorites are the red Reuben basil, all purple leaves, very lovely, and a new one for us called Persian basil. These are both Ocinum basilicums, and they're wonderful additions to the garden. These are both excellent as salad additions. So we always think of basil having to be made into something, but it doesn't have to be made into anything in particular. As a salad green, it's terrific. This one here we started to grow 2 years ago, the Persian basil. And at first I said, well, it's pretty, but what else is so interesting about it? And then I tried it. And that's the fun thing about these basils, is to try the leaves before you actually cook with them. It's amazing. Just a slight citrusy undertone to it, a little bit of clove, a little bit of cinnamon to it. It's really wonderful. It makes a nice little pesto, or add it to a salsa. It's wonderful in salads. Super pretty, easy to grow, and it gives you just a completely different look to your garden. The purple basils, again like the red Reuben, are again lovely as a salad addition. They also can be used for a rustic pesto. So you wouldn't want to over-process this basil. If you take this beautiful purple basil and you just chop it so that it's still fairly rough in your pesto, you'll keep that beautiful purple color. If you over-process it so that it's very smooth, it becomes a bit of a muddy color. The flavor is still good, but it's not quite as an appealing look to it. So make sure you just leave it very rustic looking. So there's some lovely choices there with your purple basils. Now maybe you don't have space for a big basil. All the basils we've talked about so far, these basils all get 18 inches, 2 feet tall. They're pretty darn big. Sometimes you need something that's a little smaller, and that's where spicy bush basil comes in. These are called piccolino basils, tiny little leaf, very small plant. It only gets 10 to 12 inches tall. This is the one in particular in Italy. They say you put a little bit of this on your windowsill, and that tells your suitors that it's time to come calling. The great thing about these small basils is they may be small in size, but they're really big in flavor. So why you'd grow this, even if you have room for a big basil? It's the flavor. Super punchy, super strong. This basil will hold up to being cooked. So rather than use the other basils in your sauces, you would use this beautiful little small-leafed basil, because even when it's cooked, even when it's heated up in pizza or sauces, it maintains that wonderful basil flavor. There's lots of small leaf basils. This is called spicy bush basil. I really love it because it just keeps going and going all season long. You can really prune it back and it comes right back. The flavor is really amazing on this basil. We do have a whole different class of basils, and these are called tulsi, or sacred or holy basils. These really have a different purpose for us. It's a whole different species. It's called Ocynum tenuiflorum or sanctum. And these basils are considered sacred for the Hindus. There's many different varieties of them. We grow several. We grow a beautiful one called Kapoor. Kapoor basil takes on these beautiful greenish leaves, heavy clove flavor. It's wonderful medicinal. It's also a great one to use for cooking if you're doing Asian cuisine or curries. This one here is called Rama, and this is our most important medicinal basil. So I mentioned that basils are good for digestion, but also this particular species of basil, the Ocynum tenuiflorum, this one is also excellent as an adaptogen, meaning this basil you can actually use every day as a tonic in a tea form or a tincture, and it helps reduce stress. So we can all use a little bit of this in our life every day. So it's a great stress reducer. It's good for bringing our bodies back into balance. Really a wonderful herb. These basils here, the tulsis, the sacred basils, these are used often as a sacred plant that every Hindu family grows at their front door. They have it somewhere in their home. It's part of their tradition. And so here in the United States, we do grow it for medicinal, and we also grow it for cooking as well. Also, we have Thai basil. And Thai basil is that classic basil that we use in Thai cuisine. Super, super heavy licorice, clove scented, almost a little bit of spiciness to it. Very beautiful to look at. It's a fairly small basil, and it goes to flower very quickly. So you're always pinching it back to keep it from flowering too much. You'd use this in really heavy cuisines in Thai cuisine. All the basils I've shown you so far are annual basils that we grow from seed, but there are some amazing new basils out there that you should be growing in your garden. This one is called Pesto perpetuo. It is so wonderful. Notice that variegated leaf? This is a basil that is a Genovese style basil, so it's perfect in your garden to use for pesto making, but it has this one particularly wonderful quality about it. It does not bloom, so you never have to pinch back the blooms on this basil. It's wonderful in a container, it's great in a pot. It's a little more cold hardy, so it can actually take a little more cold temperatures. Usually here in California, it will stay in our gardens until November. And if you live somewhere like Santa Barbara, it will overwinter with no problem. This is a beautiful, beautiful specimen plant to have in a container. It's lovely, even if you don't like basil for cooking. It is a wonderfully pretty plant to grow in the garden. Now the opposite of that are basils that we actually want to flower in the garden. These kinds of basils are sterile hybrids. It's my favorite. Well, after lemon basil, this is my favorite. This basil is called Wild Magic, and notice it's blooming. We let this basil bloom on purpose. It gives lots of nectar to honeybees, but it doesn't produce any seed. So you can let it bloom. It doesn't produce seed and die like your other annual basils do. It gets about 14 inches tall. It is amazing looking in the garden, just beautiful. It tastes great. It has a wonderful basil flavor, perfect for pesto making, wonderful to cook with. It's very cold hardy. Here in California, in Northern California, we actually grow this one out in the garden usually until Christmas time or even later. It's lovely to have in the garden, and it's a beautiful plant to include even just with your perennial bed. So it will bring in lots of wonderful pollinators. We also like small little basils that will bloom in the garden. This one's called Red Ball. It's a gorgeous little specimen plant. It only gets about 12 inches tall, has that great purpley look to it, and a pink flower later on. Again, this one is another sterile specimen, so you can let it bloom. It'll bring wonderful pollinators into the garden. It doesn't change the flavor, unlike the other annual basils I showed you earlier, that once they start to bloom, you really have to get rid of those flowers quickly. So again, gorgeous, gorgeous, maybe lining your bed. Instead of annual flowers, why not put in something that's yummy and helpful to bring in pollinators into your garden? Very pretty specimen plant. One of our most popular ones is a basil called Magic Mountain. So this basil looks very familiar to a basil that people are familiar with called African blue. The difference is that African blue tastes like camphor, which is not anyone's favorite flavor usually, but this one, mild sweet basil flavor for this Magic Mountain basil. This is about a 2-footer. Again, this one will bloom, but it's sterile, so it never produces seed. We only grow it from cuttings. Isn't that a lovely specimen plant? Finally, we also grow one called a jaca. This has a big pink flower, and this plant tastes very similar to our Thai basil. So this has a punch to it. This one, spicy, heavy clove. This one you want to use for all your Asian cuisine. It's really delicious. Lovely in the garden. It can get about 2 feet tall. Again, it's going to last until November. It's a lot more cold hardy. So all of these basils that I've just shown you, these are wonderful to have in your garden, just to give more color for one thing, to include in their garden that's going to go into the fall. Some people do bring these indoors and use these indoors during the winter if they have enough light. And you can let them bloom, except for your Pesto Perpetua, which of course will never bloom. And so that's its best quality, is not having to pinch it back. Wonderful new additions that people are just becoming familiar with now and growing in their gardens. So now you've decided you have many more basils to choose from. How are you going to plant those basils? There's a couple little tricks to planting basil so that you have a long harvest and so that your plants look good throughout the season. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you're going to grow your basil under the best conditions possible. So you've decided to plant all these different basils in your garden. What can you do to make sure that you have a success growing them? I'm showing you here how to grow basil in a raised bed. Now you can grow basil in a raised bed. There's a benefit to that because you can raise it up if you have a bad soil, like a really heavy clay soil. It's also a benefit because it warms the soil a little earlier in the season, so you can actually get root growth a little easier. And of course, it helps because it's lifted up, so you don't have to sit down so far, you don't have to be on your knees to harvest. So if you have a raised bed, you want to make sure you have soil that's very usable and good. So here we use a soil booster, and we use a soil that we purchase in that has lots of organic matter, lots of earthworm castings, a little bit of bat guano. It also has some organic slow-release fertilizer. You can see it's fairly light. It's not really sandy, but it's not this heavy clay. So you don't want to use native soil if you're in a raised bed. Now, if you're just growing in the ground, then you would add this kind of a mix at a rate of about 30%. Or if it's a heavy clay, even up to 50%, you would mix into that top foot of soil where you're going to be planting. This will give you really good drainage because basil doesn't want to be really hard in a hard, heavy soil. So it wants very good, rich soil. So there's a trick to basil also that you don't really talk about with the rest of the herbs. So you're going to hear me say this first week, and it's going to sound very different after this, what I'm going to be talking about. Basil likes water and it likes fertilizer. It's incredibly different than rosemary or sage or lavender or any of those other herbs that we are so familiar with. So when you plant it, you want to add some fertilizer. I'm going to add some Sure Start. I like to use an organic fertilizer, and we only use organic fertilizers for our culinary plants. This particular one has some microbes in it that I really love to use. You don't need to use much. We're going to add in just about a teaspoon. And so here we have our 4-inch plant. I'm going to take where I'm going to plant it, and you notice I've spaced these out. Some of these plants are very close together because they're small, and some of them, like the Genovese basil, I've moved way back because it's going to be a much larger one. This is the red ball basil that we just talked about. It's a small, short basil. We actually let it bloom. I'm going to mix in that fertilizer, and then I'm going to go ahead, pull it out of its pot. The roots are pretty good. They don't have to be pulled apart. They're not overly close together here. You don't need for the plant to be any deeper than the soil it came in, so you want to make sure it's just even. And there you've got your first plant in the ground. It's got a little bit of fertilizer right up against the root system. Later on, and in the case of basil, later on means once a month, we're going to be adding more fertilizer. You can add a slow release fertilizer. You could add a liquid fertilizer, such as a fish emulsion with a little bit of sea kelp in it. Either of these can be used on a monthly basis. If you're growing in a little container, you'd be fertilizing with this every 2 weeks, but in a raised bed or in the ground, once a month is enough. We're also going to plant so that we can water this in. I'm not going to water it now, but once I get my bed all planted in, we're going to water it heavily. And this is going to be watered during a hot sunny day, probably every other day or every third day. If this was planted with lavender and rosemary, we'd be watering once a week at the most. So very different watering techniques. Now, if you don't water and fertilize enough, you end up with a basil that looks something like this. So notice it's kind of yellow, and this is a cinnamon basil here. Notice it's actually getting ready to bloom. Right up here you can actually see that little blossom start. So people tend to take that blossom and they might just pinch it off just like that. And that's great. Except that's not going to really reprogram that plant back to being a juvenile. So the idea with basil is you want to keep it young and spry, and that's why we fertilize and water it a lot. So I would do this. Go ahead and use that for your cooking unless it's a little bit too bitter. The second these little basils start to put on seeds or flowers, they start to get bitter. You're going to cut that much off that basil, and then you're going to fertilize it with either liquid or the slow release, and you're going to make sure it stays nice and moist. You can see as I pull it out of the pot here, this is a fairly dry plant right here. So when it dries down, it thinks, oh no, and doesn't have enough food. Then it really thinks, oh no, I'm going to die. I better have babies. So that's why it sets flowers and seeds. And in these kinds of basils, your main goal is to stop that from happening. Now remember, some of these other basils we grow, like this one here, our Wild Magic. This one's sterile, so you can let this one bloom. You don't have to prune it. This one's actually wonderful to allow it to bloom for pollinators, and it won't change the flavor at all. If it does start to look a little tired looking though, you would actually just come in and actually pinch off. Let's see if I can actually pinch it here. You would actually pinch off. You'd actually remove that much of the plant. Fertilize it, water it, and that way you'll get a nice full plant again. Very edible. And remember, if you have a culinary herb that you can eat the leaves, you can eat the flowers. So basil flowers are wonderful and you should eat them. So what do they taste like? They're going to taste like basil, only a little fruitier and a little more rounded. Here's a few in my hand here. Wonderful to add to a salad, or if you're doing even something simple like deviled eggs to put on top. A nice edible garnish, very yummy. And kids love it. Super flowery flavor to it. So still basil, but sweet. So after about a month, make sure you come back in. You're going to fertilize heavily. You're going to add your fertilizer again. And then you're going to make sure you're watering a bed like this about every other day. We have a few basils that we've been growing for a while. This is that beautiful Ajaca. So you can see how once it starts to fill in, it's a gorgeous plant, not just for cooking, but in the garden as well. So maybe in another month, we'll come back in and we'll take a quick shot of this so you can see how our garden has progressed over the last month. Some things will be blooming happily. We'll add a few tomatoes. And in the end, we'll have this beautiful garden of basil that we can use for everything from cooking, medicine making. We can use it for crafting. We can use it for edible flowers, even nice bouquets we can use it for. And we can make a nice after dinner cocktail or glass of tea. It's beautiful. I love it. I love basil. So if you have any questions, you can always go to our website, morningsunfarm.com, for more information. Also, you can join us next week to learn more about herbs. Next week, we're going to be talking about the 5 essential herbs that you need in every culinary garden. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope we see you next week.